you can go to the website, which is www.gengenova.com. It'll be on the first slide I show you. And you can find the slides on the home page under Pamunkey. And there's also a lot of really good beginner information and links on that slide. I'm sorry, on that website, if you'd like to go check it out. Okay, let me see if I can figure out how to share my screen. Here we go. Okay. All right, so I wasn't sure how many participants we were going to have and what experience you will have had with genetic genealogy. So I made this a very beginner presentation. This is intro to genetic genealogy, starting from the very beginning. And it's designed for people who haven't even taken a test yet, or if you have taken a test, you're not quite sure what to do with the results that you got back. So this is very beginner material, and I'm not going to go into any biology. So I think the presentation is going to take about 20 or 30 minutes, and so you should have 30 minutes at the end to ask any questions you want. If you have more advanced questions, that's fine too. So thank you, Kate, for inviting me. I'm very excited to share this with you. I've been doing genetic genealogy for about 5 years now. I took my ancestry DNA test in 2015, and then I got my whole family to take one. And I started getting all these inquiries from people who were related to me or to one of the kits that I manage. And all of these people wanted my help to help them figure out who our most recent common ancestor is. MRCA is most recent common ancestor, and that's what you're always trying to figure out when you're looking at your DNA matches. How are we related? Who is the common person? And so I helped all these people. I was working through it with them, and I suddenly realized the power of genetic genealogy to break through gaps in the paper trail, because we all have these brick wall ancestors that we just can't find any paperwork on. And it's so frustrating because sometimes we're even looking in the wrong place. You know, sometimes we're looking in the wrong state or even the wrong country. And so that's where genetic genealogy can be so helpful. It can just help you identify leads that you can follow up later. So I enjoyed helping these people so much that I decided to go ahead and get certified. So I did the Boston University certificate program in genealogical studies, and I'm currently doing the University of Toronto's National Institute of, I always forget what that acronym is. It's the Professional Learning Certificate in Genealogical Studies. So that's what I'm working on now. And I highly recommend both of those programs, actually. So if you have any questions about that at the end, if you're looking for some programs to do, they're both online. You don't have to go anywhere. And they're very, very fun. Okay, so as I said, here's the link, www.gengenova.com/Pamunkey, and you can find a copy of the slides that we're about to go through. So, starting at the beginning, what is genetic genealogy? In a nutshell, we attempt, we don't always succeed, we attempt to use DNA to answer genealogical questions. And the questions that DNA typically addresses are who questions. So who was my great-grandfather? Or if you're adopted, who was my biological mother, for example. It can also address more distant questions, such as your great-great-great-grandfather. I've actually found the most distant ones I've found were 7th great-grandparents using DNA. So you can go right on back there. It's a lot of work, but you can do it. DNA can also illuminate migration patterns and ethnicity, and that information can be useful in context to figure out if it was this ancestor or that ancestor. The way I think of genetic genealogy is I basically think of it as a human jigsaw puzzle. So if you like putting puzzles together, if you like visualizing large amounts of information and trying to move it around and figure out what order it might go into and assemble a larger whole, then I think you'll really like genetic genealogy. If you don't like jigsaw puzzles, then I think you might find it frustrating because it takes, sorry, I keep getting pop-ups. There's a lot of information that you have to sift through. If you've already taken a DNA test, I'm sure you've had that moment where you look at all your DNA matches and you have hundreds of matches and you don't know who any of these people are. So that's why I say if you're overwhelmed by that much information, you might find it not fun. But I think it's like just, I do it as a hobby and a job. So most of my clients have been adoptees and or the children of adoptees. So I'm typically looking for recent ancestors, parents, grandparents. We can't know, unfortunately, in advance before we take the test whether we're going to be successful, because it really just depends on how many DNA matches you get and how close to you they are. And I would say that people who are recent immigrants to the United States have a much lower chance of finding useful matches, whereas people who their family has been here for a few generations, they're much more likely to find matches. You may not know who the people are, but you will have matches. As with all genealogical research, it is very important that you start with a research question. So I gave two examples there. Who is my biological mother, or was my great-great-great-grandfather a Livingston? You have to start with one question, and it's really best to do one ancestor at a time. Even when I'm working with adoptees, I have to do a separate report for the mother and a separate report for the father, because it's two different sets of DNA matches and two different family trees. And so you want to look for one person at a time. Otherwise, you're going to get confused and go off on a tangent and forget who you were looking for. And it's just better to have one question at a time. Oh dear, my button's not working. There we go. So I put together this timeline because I wanted to illustrate for you that genetic genealogy is a really new science. The term genetic genealogy, the first instance that it's been found in print was 1989. So it just kind of emerged into the public consciousness in 1989. And then in 1997 was when Jewish researchers were able to prove that the Y chromosome, which is only found in men, can be used to trace patrilineal ancestry. So the father of the father of the father, that's the patrilineal line. And in 2000, Family Tree DNA marketed the first commercial DNA test, at-home DNA test. And in 2004, genetic genealogy became popular enough to attract mainstream book publishers. And in 2012, Ancestry marketed their first autosomal test at home to US customers. And then in 2015, they expanded it to the UK and Ireland. I included this information because I just want you to realize it's still a very new science. So there's a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot that's still changing. As recently as 2018, the Board for Certification of Genealogists released new standards for how they want DNA to be incorporated in proofs, and just, new standards for dealing with DNA. And Ancestry continually updates their ethnicity estimates. The first estimates that we received way back in 2015 or 2016 were pretty inaccurate. They had me listed as 12% Italian, and I'm really not Italian. but it really kind of messed me up because I have one great-grandfather who is unknown because my paternal grandmother was illegitimate. She never knew who her father was. And it just so happens that each of our great-grandparents could contribute around 12% of our DNA. So when I saw that I was 12% Italian, I thought, oh my goodness, I have, you know, an Italian immigrant great-grandfather that I'm looking for. And so I did actually spend some time looking for possible residents of the right time and place. And it turned out that was a total wild goose chase because I'm not Italian at all. They released revised ethnicity estimates in 2018, 2019, and again, just about 2 weeks ago. So if you've taken an ancestry test already, you should have received revised ethnicity estimates just recently. And the reason they keep revising it is the original estimates were based on a very small sample size. And as they have gotten more data, more kits, they're constantly increasing their sample size. So you're actually getting better estimates each time. And now I think they're getting pretty good, at least for some populations. But for example, my stepfather is Polish and Luxembourgish, I don't know which one it is. But his people were from Luxembourg and Poland, and his estimates now are pretty accurate. But my people were the original Protestant refugees who came over here very early, and it's still showing my ancestry as disproportionately British. It's not giving me any German, and I have at least 6 lines that came from Germany, so I have 0% German now, which doesn't seem right. So I'm not sure they're completely there yet, but they are working on it. So what types of DNA can we use? There are 3 main types of DNA tests. The first one is the one that everyone takes, and the other 2 are much less common. So autosomal DNA or ATS-DNA is what the ancestry test is. And there's also tests you can get from family tree DNA. That would be their family finder test. And from MyHeritage, they do an autosomal test. And 23andMe, of course, does an autosomal test. Autosomal just means it's from your 46 autosomes, the autosomal chromosomes, not the sex chromosomes. And this genetic material is randomly inherited 50-50 from each of your parents. So your mom gave you 50% and your dad gave you 50%. And the randomness is very important here. It's why if you have siblings, they may not test at the same ethnicity percentages that you do. It's totally possible for your full biological siblings to have slightly different ethnicity percentages than you do because you didn't all inherit the same DNA from your parents. And this is also why when you're doing you're looking for distant genealogical relatives, it helps if you have many DNA kits because you may not have all of the DNA matches that other people have. So you may have actually different DNA matches because of the randomness of your DNA segments. This type of DNA is used for most kinship questions. This can answer most of our genealogical questions. And it's also the cheapest test. So if you buy it on sale, it's typically $49 to $59. I wouldn't recommend paying full price. It goes on sale about 4 times a year. And it just involves spitting in a test tube and shaking it up and sending it back. It's really very easy. You're not supposed to eat for half an hour before you take the test. The second type of DNA that we sometimes use is called Y-DNA. And this is only found in men, but that doesn't mean women can't use it. If you have a brother, for example, you can use him as a proxy for your Y, you don't have Y-DNA, but he does. I don't have any siblings, so I asked a cousin to take the test for me. Y-DNA is passed from father to son, and it's primarily used for surname studies because in an ideal world, the Y-DNA would follow a surname, but that doesn't happen because people are adopted, people are maybe illegitimate, and sometimes the surname didn't come about. In other words, the Y-DNA goes back further than the surname. Y-DNA, unlike autosomal DNA, mutates very slowly. So autosomal DNA will only take you back about 500 years, maybe not even that far, maybe 400, maybe if you have a what they call an endogamous family tree, which means the various branches of your tree are intertwined due to intermarriage. You don't have 4 separate branches of your tree. In that case, it may only take you back about 200 or 300 years. So autosomal DNA is time delimited. It doesn't go back forever. But Y-DNA mutates much more slowly, which means you get less mutations per generation. And therefore, it can go back quite far. When my cousin took the Y-DNA test for me for our surname study, he got matches from the Middle East and Russia, and I mean, all over the place. He got matches in languages I couldn't identify the alphabet. So I'm guessing those are not close DNA matches. But the utility of Y-DNA is that it can help you identify, for example, in the case that I'm going to go through with you in just a few minutes, it can help you figure out if the person you're looking for was the man or the woman when you don't know either one of the parents. So that's what it's useful for, is figuring out where the paternal line came from. And then mitochondrial DNA is sort of an outlier. I don't know anyone who has used this yet. It's not a common thing to use. Mitochondrial DNA is passed from mothers to every single one of their children, and it mutates extremely slowly. So it covers a much longer time frame even than Y-DNA. And because of that, it's kind of not useful for genealogical studies because we don't want to know what was happening, 1,000 years ago. We want something that we could actually find a record for. So, but I think they are I think they're still working on making that more usable. So perhaps with more advanced technology or testing or whatever, they'll figure out a way to make that useful. But people currently use it now to trace ethnicity, the matrilineal ethnicity. In other words, your mother's 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 mother. That's what matrilineal means. People use that to find ethnicity and also to trace migration patterns. But as I said, it goes back pretty far. And those tests can be quite pricey. Actually, the Y-DNA test can be quite pricey too. Y-DNA typically costs over $100 and can go up to, $500 or even $1,000, depending on what exactly you're testing for. That's why I don't recommend testing willy-nilly. I don't recommend just taking a test for the sake of it. I would recommend taking one autosomal test, such as Ancestry or 23andMe. I actually prefer Ancestry, and I'll tell you why later. And then just start with that and see if you find a need for additional testing. But I don't like to see people spend a lot of money on testing if they don't have a specific need for it. All right, so which companies should you test with? I have to minimize these windows. There we go. So which companies should you test with? This chart I actually borrowed from another genealogist named Dr. Leah Larkin. And she's been updating her database with the number of subscribers per test database since 2017. So the last update she received, I guess, was 2019 for most of the providers except for 23andMe, and I guess they haven't updated theirs for a while. The industry was undergoing a slowdown, and I think in slowdowns they don't like to report their numbers. Ancestry has, as you can see in the green line, they have over 16 million subscribers. So Ancestry has about 50% more than their next closest competitor, which would be 23andMe. And that, for that reason alone, is why I prefer Ancestry, because the reason you're taking the test is to find matches. And so you want to test the company that has the most kits. The only exception I would say to that is if you, for example, were a recent immigrant and maybe you weren't expecting to find a lot of American DNA matches, then possibly 23andMe might be a better choice for you. The other companies, MyHeritage only has about 4 million as of 2019. GEDmatch has only 1.3 million, and Family Tree DNA has the lowest at just over 1 million. But what most people do is purchase, for example, an Ancestry autosomal kit and take that test and send it back to Ancestry. And when you get your Ancestry results, when they've processed your kit, you are able at that point to download your raw data file, which is a ginormous file full of all of your DNA markers. And you're able to upload that to the other companies that you didn't test with. For example, if you test with Ancestry, you can upload your raw data file to MyHeritage, GEDmatch, and Family Tree DNA. 23andMe, unfortunately, won't accept that, won't accept an Ancestry file, and vice versa, Ancestry won't accept a 23andMe file. But the other three companies will. And that's what most people do to maximize their DNA matches while not spending a lot of money. I think some of the sites charge you maybe $5 or $10 to upload your data file, but it's not as expensive as taking a separate test. Some other reasons why I prefer Ancestry are, in addition to being the largest database, for me personally, I often work with other people's DNA. In other words, it's not just my kits, I'm working with other people's DNA. And Ancestry allows you to assign a viewer to your DNA kit. So for example, if you were doing a family DNA project with other relatives, you could let them view your DNA matches without actually having to log into your account with your user ID and password. And I really appreciate that because I don't like logging in. I don't like having other people's login credentials. So that to me is a huge plus in the Ancestry column. The other nice things about Ancestry, I think they have the best matching algorithm. They tend to give you really accurate totals of shared DNA so that you can then guesstimate how closely your DNA matches are to you. I'll show you a chart in a few minutes that shows other companies sometimes overestimate the amount of shared DNA, and that causes you to look for the shared ancestor in a more recent generation than they could possibly exist. So then you're just pulling your hair out trying to find somebody who isn't there yet. Another thing you want to think about when you're taking these tests is privacy. Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch have a rather poor record on privacy because they were caught sharing people's ancestry, genealogical DNA kits with law enforcement. And some people were very upset about that simply because they weren't asked, they weren't told, it was just happening behind the scenes. So now Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch have a permission slip that you have to, sign if you want your DNA to be shared or not. But unfortunately, Family Tree also got caught opting you in instead of opting you out. So if you didn't check the permission slip, you would just be automatically opted in, and that rubs some people the wrong way. I think that's why they have, they're not performing as well as the other companies. MyHeritage is actually a really lovely user interface. That's my favorite thing to look at DNA matches in because it's just a really pretty user interface. And they have a chromosome browser, which a chromosome browser allows you to visualize the precise segments of DNA that you share with other people. And then it's possible to triangulate, in other words, to find other people who also match to you on that specific DNA segment, which would mean that they're definitely related to you on the same ancestor. And it's just a very clean and beautiful user interface. Unfortunately, because they have a quarter of the DNA kits that Ancestry has, I just don't use them as often because, you know, you're 75% less likely to find a match there. Okay. So what influences our success? When I think about the cases where I was able to answer the research question and the cases where I wasn't able to answer the research question, what it really all comes down to is large families, because large families produce lots of siblings, and the siblings give you more chances to find vital records, which might mention the parent's name, for example, more chances to find obituaries that might mention important details about the family. And also the siblings provide your future DNA matches. So families with lots of siblings really increase your odds of success. Long marriages also help. Cases when, you know, the wife passed away giving birth to the firstborn child, that's rough because you don't always notice that wife died, because then the husband would have remarried pretty quickly after that, and you're thinking all of the children belong to the second wife when in fact the first one didn't. So short marriages make it kind of challenging. Newspaper articles are sometimes the only source of information you have on the most recent 2 generations of people. So for example, your closest DNA matches, you might have a hard time finding vital records about them because of privacy restrictions. So newspaper articles and obituaries really help you research. And also uncommon names are very helpful because you can even Google those people sometimes and find information. When I think about when I haven't been successful, it's because I couldn't find enough close matches, or the matches that I found didn't have a family tree, or it was a private family tree, or it was an incorrect family tree. That happens also. Or cases of endogamy. Endogamy is when people's families are related in more than one way. So it can mean somebody married a first cousin, or it can just mean that they were all intermarrying with the same 3 families over a period of 100 years. And that's why also illegitimacy is a tough thing to handle. So I think I mentioned that my grandmother never knew her father. I actually have a fairly close DNA match who looks like he should be my half-second cousin, and he could actually be descended from the same great-grandfather that I'm looking for. But unfortunately, he doesn't have a family tree, and he was not interested in discussing genealogy when I finally found him on Facebook. So he's not really interested in helping my search, and you're not allowed to pressure people if they don't want to help you. You know, you have to respect their privacy. So unfortunately, even though I do have a fairly close DNA match on the line that answers the research question, I still haven't been able to figure that out. It's frustrating because I think if I knew who his parents were, I would figure out in about, you know, one day. But you have to respect people's privacy. And there's always another way to solve the problem. It just might take a lot longer. So when you look at your list of DNA matches and you're wondering what to do with all of these, what you're really looking for in each DNA match is who is the most recent common ancestor that I share with that person. And if the DNA match is over 100 centimorgans, that's somebody that you're going to be able to figure out. That's enough DNA that it's a fairly close ancestor. So you should be able to figure it out. What you're going to have to do is make unless the person has a really reliable, well-documented family tree, which almost nobody does, you're going to have to make a family tree yourself for each of your DNA matches. And what you want to keep in mind is you should always make those private trees, and you should also make them unsearchable trees, because you have to respect that person's privacy also. You're allowed to do the research on their family, but you don't want to publicize it. You don't know if they have things in their family tree they would prefer to keep secret. And when you're looking at your DNA matches, what you want to be visualizing is a first cousin will tell you who your grandparents are. A second cousin will tell you who your great-grandparents are. A third cousin will tell you who your great-great-grandparents are. That will be the shared ancestor. And so that's what you want to keep in mind, depending on how far away the ancestor is that you're looking for. If you're looking for a grandparent or a great-grandparent, you probably don't want to mess around with fourth cousins, because that's just going to cause you a lot of extra work. You want to use more recent cousins if you can find them. So how do we interpret shared DNA amounts? As I mentioned just a moment ago, we quantify shared DNA in this unit of measurement called centimorgans, and we abbreviate that as cm, little c, big M. And it's just a way of quantifying how much DNA you share with another person. As I said, if you share more than 100 centimorgans with someone, you have a very good chance of finding the shared ancestor. I have found shared ancestors with people who shared as little as 9 centimorgans. So I don't want to scare you off of using the little numbers. The little numbers are useful too, but those can also be pretty far away. This chart was developed by a man named Blaine Bettinger, and he's sort of the godfather of genetic genealogy. He has a blog called The Genetic Genealogist. You can see it up there in the top left corner, thegeneticgenealogist.com. I do strongly recommend checking out his blog, and he also published several books, and he has videos on YouTube, and he speaks at conferences. He's a really good speaker and a good teacher, and I highly recommend him. He developed this chart called the Shared CM Project, and he's currently on version 4, which was just released a few months ago in March. He analyzed hundreds and now thousands of DNA matches to figure out what the possible range of shared DNA is for various genealogical relationships. So for example, if you and I are first cousins, how much DNA would we share on average, and how much DNA could we share? What would be the outlying probabilities? And you can see he came up with, right here in the middle, you can see that first cousins would share an average of 866 centimorgans, but they could share as little as 396 centimorgans or as much as 1,397. So that is a range of over 1,000. That's like a pretty big range. And that's what makes DNA so difficult to analyze. That's what makes genetic genealogy hard, is the randomness. It's the unpredictability, because you never know if someone's going to be on the average or if they're going to be on the low end or the high end. And it makes a big difference in what generation you're looking for the shared ancestor. In other words, how closely related that person is to you. When you take an ancestry test, they do try to guesstimate for you how that person is related to you. So if you had a DNA match who shared 750 centimorgans with you, Ancestry would go ahead and estimate that as a first cousin. But that doesn't mean they are your first cousin. The 750 centimorgans could be a first cousin once removed. It could be a great aunt or a great uncle. It could be a great grandparent. It could be the converse of those relationships. It could be a great grandchild. It could be a great niece or great nephew. And Some of those relationships you can exclude based on age. You know, somebody couldn't be your great grandparent, I don't think, if you were approximately the same age. So some of the relationships you can eliminate based on age, but others you really can't. And so you're kind of grappling with, well, how is that person related to me? And you have to leave that sort of open until you've done some more research on their family tree. And hopefully you see a name or a location that you recognize. As you get further, more distant genealogically, if you look at these right columns in the light yellow, purple, and white, you'll see that at distances of 4th to 6th or even further cousins, it gets very unpredictable. There's significant overlap here. And everything past 3rd cousins has a chance of not sharing any DNA with you at all. So you don't share DNA with 100% of your genealogical relatives past 3rd cousins. There is an increasing probability that you won't share DNA with them after 3rd cousins. So that also throws a wrinkle in there. But this chart is extremely useful. I use this chart almost every day. They have an interactive version of the chart at www.dnapainter.com. And it's nice because you can just type in the amount of shared DNA and it will automatically tell you the possible relationships for that amount of shared DNA and the probabilities. So which one is most likely? But I would caution you against playing probabilities because sometimes it is the 2%. You know, sometimes it is the most unlikely option. That happens sometimes. All right. I wanted to show you this chart to illustrate how unpredictable DNA can be. This chart shows 5 siblings. They're all siblings to each other, and they're all my 3rd cousins once removed. So if you'll notice, the person called sibling number 7 shares really a lot of DNA with me. She shares 173 centimorgans with me, which is, you know, a significant amount. But her sibling number 1 shares only about 1/3 of that. She only shares 61 centimorgans with me. The average amount of shared DNA for 3rd cousins once removed is 48 centimorgans. So they're all over the average, but siblings number 5 and 7 are way over. And if you'll notice, ancestry DNA is shown in the 2nd column, and then the other columns show the other test providers. So for example, if we look at sibling number 1, Ancestry says I share 61 centimorgans with her. My heritage says I share 78.7 centimorgans with her. Family tree DNA says I share 97 centimorgans with her, which is like 50% more than Ancestry. And GEDmatch says I share 82.1. They're all different. And frankly, I feel like the other testing companies are sometimes overestimating. They're counting too much shared DNA, which may not in fact be shared. They're counting maybe segments that are too small. And so if you were relying solely on those other databases, you might be looking for an ancestor that was not your 3rd cousin once removed. You might be thinking it's like a 2nd cousin, and then you would be struggling in vain to make your family trees line up at the great-grandparent level. So what are your odds of finding a match? This diagram was prepared by the International Society of Genetic Genealogy. They call it cousin statistics, and it shows your chance of sharing DNA segments with your relatives of varying degrees. So 23andMe is in the 2nd column, Ancestry is in the 3rd column, and Family Tree DNA Family Finder is in the 3rd column. 1st cousins have a 100% chance of sharing DNA on any platform. 2nd cousins, pretty much 100%. 3rd cousins, you start losing a little bit of probability, but on Ancestry, you're still at 98% sharing with your 3rd cousins. When you get down to 4th cousins, you're starting to drop now. So fourth cousins on 23andMe only have a 45.9% chance of matching, of sharing DNA segments. Fourth cousins on Ancestry have a lot higher chance, of 71% chance. In other words, Ancestry has a better chance of recognizing your genealogical relatives than some of the other providers. But even on Ancestry, when you get down to fifth cousins, you only have a 32% chance of sharing, of matching with them. When you get down to sixth cousins, you're down to 11% chance. And the reason this is important is because if you're looking for a distant relative, like say your great-great-great-grandfather, you're only going to see a small percentage of your genealogical relatives as your DNA matches. So it's not that they haven't tested, it's not that they're not in the database, it's just that they don't share the same segments from that ancestor that you do. And so you don't match. And that's why if you're looking for distant relatives, it is extremely helpful to get as many kits as you can from relatives. So your first, second, third cousins, siblings, you know, anyone who's interested in genealogy, anyone who wants to help with their family research. The further back you go, the more kits you need to get an accurate picture of all of your relatives. So if you've already taken a test and you're looking at this list of DNA matches and you're not quite sure what to do with it, one interesting thing you can do, which is sometimes helpful, is create a Leeds diagram. A Leeds diagram was developed by Dana Leeds, who's another genetic genealogist. She called it the Leeds method of DNA color clustering. And I provided a link there because she has extensive instructions for how to create this diagram. But in a nutshell, what you're doing is separating or sorting all of your DNA matches as if they were playing cards. So you're sorting the hearts, you're sorting the clubs, you're sorting the diamonds and the spades. You're sorting your DNA matches by each of your four grandparents. And you can do this even if you don't know who your grandparents were. So even if you were adopted and you didn't know who your grandparents were, this method will still work for you. The way you do it is you start with DNA matches that are under 400 centimorgans. So you're starting with DNA matches that aren't too close to you because you don't want to pick up any first cousins. You're trying to get your second cousins and more distant. And the reason for that is your first cousins obviously share two grandparents with you, not just one. So they would be taking up two columns. And you really want to get four separate columns if you can. So the reason this is useful is if you're looking for an unknown ancestor on a particular line, this enables you to sort your DNA matches to find out which one could possibly inform that search. It just allows you to separate the wheat from the chaff a little bit. And as I said, if you go to Dana Leeds' website, she has instructions, really good instructions for how to do that. Ancestry also has started letting you color code your DNA matches. That was something they introduced, I think, about a year ago, that you can assign each of your ancestors a color, and then you can use that color to identify the DNA matches who are associated with that ancestor. And that's super helpful because you can't possibly remember how all of these people are related to you. The color coding really helps. So what are the limitations of DNA? The only relationships that can be proven solely with DNA, only with DNA, no documentation, are parent, child, and full siblings. So parents and their children share an awful lot of DNA. They share, I think, 3,500, a very large number of centimorgans. And no other genetic relationship shares that much DNA. So you can identify a parent and a child relationship simply by DNA with no paperwork. Full siblings also share a significant amount of DNA. I can't read that, that's very small, but full siblings can be identified with just DNA. But every other relationship, you cannot prove it using only DNA. And actually, it's really rare to get a parent or sibling match on a DNA test. Most people don't get that. Most people get half siblings if they're lucky, but even those are rare. Most people just get cousins. And so you can't prove anything solely with DNA. You have to then look for documentation, or you have to have some biographical information that directs you to believe that it's this person versus that person. But the DNA won't tell you for sure if it's this person versus that person. You need more context. And another limitation is that autosomal DNA is only reliable for about 5 generations. So that's why you have to get many, many DNA kits if you want to go back further than 5 generations. And then the final limitation is only men have Y DNA. So if you have a surname question, if you have a question about the patrilineal line, you have to ask a qualifying male to take that test for you. And when I say qualifying male, it has to be somebody who is on that patrilineal line. But for example, on my unknown great grandfather, there are no males on that patrilineal line because my grandmother didn't have Y DNA and neither do I. So Y DNA can't help me with that question. So that is a limitation. So one case I wanted to walk you through, this is a very simple case of an adoptee who was looking for her biological mother using DNA matches. And she had some biographical information that was given to her adoptive parents from the hospital. I don't know if they were supposed to do that, but they did. They gave some information about the birth mother's surname and the birth mother's age and the birth mother's hometown. So that enabled us to use some context with the DNA matches to figure out the precise identity of the biological mother. The tester had some first cousin DNA matches. You can't tell by looking at your DNA matches which ones are going to be paternal and which ones are going to be maternal. So if you're an adoptee, that's one question you have to work at is how do I separate? And then you still don't know after you've separated them which is the paternal or the maternal. There's nothing in the DNA that identifies that. But we did find a first cousin that turned out to be on the maternal side. Unfortunately, she had a private family tree. And so, you know, if that family tree hadn't been private, the tester wouldn't have needed my help at all. It would have been a very simple thing to figure out. But most people do have, I shouldn't say most, a lot of people do have private family trees for various reasons. On Ancestry, however, it's possible to click on somebody's user profile, and sometimes they have more family trees there that are not private. So it's not the family tree that's linked to the DNA kit, but yet you can still see who their family is using their other trees. So I did that, and I figured out based on the family trees and the person's user ID what their name was. And then I was able to find an obituary which named the parents. And then from the parents, I was able to identify grandparents. So the grandparents, as I said before, your first cousins will lead you to your grandparents. So this first cousin did identify the tester's grandparents. And from there, I just traced the family tree through vital records and obituaries to figure out how many children they had, knowing that one of those children had to be the tester's mother. And based on the biographical information that we had about her age and location, there was only one of the children who met those criteria. So it's important to state that DNA here did not identify who the mother was because this family had, I think, 8 or 10 children, and the DNA could not differentiate between them. So I knew that it was not the mother of the first cousin, because if it had been the mother of the first cousin would have tested as a half sibling, not a first cousin. So you could rule out that one sibling, but the others were all equal as far as the DNA was concerned. So we had to use biographical information to sort that case out. And that's pretty typical of genetic genealogy. It will only take you so far, and then you have to look for some documentation. The next case is considerably more complicated. I've been working on this for over a year. This is my family, by the way. I have a third great grandfather named Hiram Livingston, and he is like a Paul Bunyan in my family. He just went everywhere, did everything. He was this mythical character, but we never knew who his parents were. He just turned up in Indiana, had my great great grandfather, and left. And so the nice thing about him leaving was that he started a second family in Oklahoma about 20 years later. And so those people ended up being my mother's, what would that be, half-third cousins. And so that enabled me to go back further and find DNA matches that my mother shared with her half-third cousins who had to be related to this Hiram character. And so that involved looking at literally hundreds of DNA matches and creating hundreds of family trees, because the further you go back, the amount of work exponentially increases. And I ended up needing to get my mother's brothers to contribute to the search because my mother did not have enough DNA matches. When I first searched her DNA matches, I found 0 Livingstons, which was kind of strange. But looking at her brother's DNA kit, I was finally able to identify some Livingstons. And it turned out I had been looking in the wrong country. Hiram Livingston's great-grandfather was a loyalist, so they were in Canada after the Revolutionary War. They had come over here from Scotland and sided with the king in the Revolutionary War, then they went to Canada. And then eventually, after 20 or 30 years, most of the descendants came back to the US. But that was why I hadn't been able to find them, if they weren't in the US when I was looking. But I think Hiram was illegitimate. And the way I figured that out was I asked my cousin to take the Y-DNA test for me. And we didn't match to any Livingston surname project. That was not conclusive, by the way, because it's not unusual to take a Y-DNA test and not match to anyone. That's actually pretty common because the test databases are not large enough. It's the same problem that the ethnicity databases were having initially. They just don't have enough reference samples to categorize your sample. So that's something that may improve over time as more people get into the Y-DNA testing. But what I did to solve that problem was I found another actual descendant of this loyalist Livingston that I was looking for. And he was a patrilineal descendant, and he took a Y-DNA test, and we did not match to him, which means that Hiram was not a patrilineal descendant of that loyalist. But yet we still have all these autosomal DNA matches, which means his mother contributed that DNA, not his father, which likely means he was illegitimate, I would guess. So that's an example of how you can use Y-DNA to shed some light on a question. And I have actually managed to trace this person's entire family tree going all the way back to the 1600s, but I still don't know who his parents were. So I know who his great grandparents were, but I don't know who his parents were because I haven't been able to find a piece of paper that says they were married or that says he was adopted or that says, you know, there's just no documentation of his birth at all. And so I'm not giving up, I'm still looking, but that is one caveat I would give you to genetic genealogy, is it can lead you to the right place to look for records, and it can give you some clues about who the relatives had to be, but it won't necessarily give you a name. It won't necessarily identify a specific individual. That's where you have to just do the paper research. So what should you consider before you take a DNA test? I always recommend that you talk to your relatives about it first, because they may ask you not to test. They may say, for example, US military cautions people that they don't want you taking a test for career reasons or who knows why. Also, people might have secrets that they're trying to hide, and they're going to be very alarmed when you tell them you're taking a DNA test. And it's better to know that that's coming versus being surprised when you get the results back. Almost everyone receives surprise relatives when they take a DNA test. It's just a question of how closely related they are to you. Your DNA may also disprove your existing genealogical research. So if your family tree is finished now and you like it that way, you know, taking a DNA test might ruin your day. And also, underrepresented populations may get less utility out of these tests initially. In other words, they might have to wait a few years for more results to trickle in before they get their DNA matches. Not everyone is going to get, you know, there can be considerable diversity in how many DNA matches people get based on how long their people have been in the United States. The testing database is still heavily biased towards Americans. And finally, where can you learn more? I put some books here that I would recommend. One of them is written by Blaine Bettinger that I talked about. I put some websites here you can check out. There's some videos you can find on YouTube, which are pretty short and interesting. And then, of course, there's conferences you can go to in person. The National Genealogical Society next year is meeting in Richmond, so that might be convenient. And they are doing a session on genetic genealogy. And I totally underestimated how long that was going to take, so it's been an hour. But I would love to answer any questions you have.
Well, I thought the presentation was amazing. Now, granted, I had access to it beforehand, so I kind of knew what we were talking about. But I think it was fantastic. And for those of you who may have already taken a test and don't know what to do with it, or are looking at taking a test, it is pretty interesting. One of the things that I did is I had my father-in-law, and my mother-in-law's brother all take DNA tests. So granted, I didn't do it to follow either the Y-DNA or the mitochondrial. We just did the autosomal. So it has been pretty interesting to see my father-in-law specifically saying, oh, I don't know that person, like they're not related to me. So, I mean, he wants to argue with what the DNA is saying. So it is pretty amusing by that. But does anybody have any questions? I can see all of you. So does anybody want me? Let me see. I'll just unmute everybody, maybe. All right, so you all should be able to unmute yourself if you have a question. Okay, I don't see anybody. Again, you know, please go ahead and, you know, email with any questions that you have, or look to see about downloading the documentation for the PowerPoint slides themselves. We will go ahead and hopefully get a video of this recording posted on our YouTube page, so you can always have that for quick reference as well. But thank you all for joining us. Monkey Library is honored to have Lisa, and hopefully we'll be able to do another session and at another time if there's enough interest. Again, I want to thank everybody. I know that this a good hour of genealogical headache sometimes. It just takes a lot to absorb, right? For those genealogy geeks, I see some of you out there. Yes, we have all gone down the rabbit hole one too many times, and this is just another rabbit hole for us to go down and enjoy it. So thank you again, Lisa. Thank you. And we look forward to seeing you again. And maybe we can all go to the conference in Richmond. That would be fun.